Good afternoon and welcome to this session tonight before we go to the main thing, which is Stone Boy's performance. We're looking forward to that. So I've got some 4 panelists with me. Ajite Anang, if you can join us, please. I'm also going to ask Matthew Rugamba to please join us on the platform. And next up is Mutuma Matthew. Manche, if you can, wherever you are, please also join us on the platform. Ajite, if you can hear me, if you're in the room, please join us. We also have one person joining us from Johannesburg, that's Dilma. Now, the amazing collaborations between African filmmakers, musicians, producers, designers, and a new generation of African writers, designers, and so on continues to flourish. Now, African cultural exhibitions are getting bigger and grander, and more of our own films as Africans are getting airtime on global streaming platforms. So my questions are very simple. Who exactly is telling our stories as Africans? How are the stories being told? And who is having our lunch? In other words, where is the money going to that we use to, to produce this content?
I think, storytelling in Africa has changed a great deal from even just 10 years ago, because there are 2 things that have happened. One is technology has become cheaper, and secondly, social media has also, opened up new markets for storytellers. So, of course, still the mainstream storytelling is controlled by Western narratives and Western interests, and a lot of the films that get made and that get noticed are actually produced by producers who are based in Europe, mostly. I'm yet to hear of an African film that has made global waves, and that has been produced entirely within the continent. There might be 1 or 2 in South Africa, but it hasn't really, they have not had the impact of, say, films like Paradise from Korea or The Squid Game. So a lot of the content that is coming out of here is still, because we have a system that means most of the money comes from the West, either Europe or America. But over the last few years, we've seen a lot of new players coming in, and these players include DSTV, and of course I've mentioned the social media like YouTube, and this has kind of opened new playing fields that mean a lot of the stories are being told by, like from within, though they don't get the kind of attention that would have gotten if,
Dilma, thank you. So now, let me start with you, Matthew. You are in the fashion industry or sector. You worry about men's accessories. By now, if I'd visited your shop, I would be looking really sharp. But today, I start with a very simple question. How exactly does fashion tell stories and stories of Africa?
I think that it's very important I'm glad you asked that question, because you have many people who feel like, okay, I'm not that into fashion. But when you look at it on a small level, every day you make decisions about what you wear. What you wear communicates your character. It communicates aspects of your lifestyle, so it tells someone something about your identity or the setting. Whether you decide to wear a blue suit or an African shirt. And I think that a couple of years ago, when Rwanda wanted to help boost the industry and of Made in Rwanda, one of the most important, everyone talks about the policies and some taxes that were reduced or eliminated for importing textiles for the industry, but one of the most important things was for government events. They now had business formal or made in Rwanda. Some events just had strictly made in Rwanda. And this started to change the minds of people. So it's very important. You use it as a form of communication. And in other aspects.
It's a personal expression as well.
Exactly. And so that's the first part of how it's linked to storytelling. But then also, fashion communicates what is going on in society, what's happening at that time. You can look at key elements of fashion to see whether people had a lot of money, whether the economy was down. All these things can be seen and traced through fashion.
Okay, let me pause it there. Let me come to Mutuma from an editorial point of view, from a newsroom perspective. The kind of stories that we're telling on Africa, who is telling these stories? How are they told? Just briefly.
Thank you, Joseph, for that question. I don't know whether you recall, in 2016, I think, there was a report that a scientific expedition had discovered dolphins in the city of Malindi, on the Kenyan coastline. Malindi has been settled since the 13th century. And it's an attraction, a tourist attraction, fundamentally because of its marine diversity. As a matter of fact, Malindi has had a marine park established there for 50 years. So one would imagine that in all those centuries and in all those years, one of the locals or one of the visitors had actually seen the dolphins that were discovered in 2016 by a scientific expedition. What does that mean? It means that on many occasions, our own African experiences lack authenticity until they are confirmed by external agency. At the national market system, the story is local. So maybe 60–70% of it is reported locally. But if you look at the regional and continental system level, our stories are still being told by international agencies, international broadcasters, and big international publishing systems. And in so doing, they deny the African the opportunity to tell his own story. And I believe that it is a fundamental right that you should be able to tell your own story so that you can authenticate your own experience, that you do not require a foreign agency to tell you that there are dolphins in your place that you have observed for centuries. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, for you, Stoneboy, man from Ashaiman to the world. Before yes, all the fans are in the house. You've just concluded a tour of Europe, in the UK and other places, I believe popularizing your latest work. From back in the village near Tema, when you were growing up, how are you telling your own story, which was the story of Ghana and the story of Ashaiman, to the world, briefly?
Thank you. I'm a proud Ashaiman boy, and Ashaiman is literally the same setting that you see across Africa, basically. When you go to Kenya, there's one place that I went to when I visited, I've forgotten, is the biggest slum. You should know it.
Kibera.
Kibera. And when I went to Kibera, I felt it. I'm like, yes, this is us representing. Why? That on its own tells our story. And already the foreign media zooms in on such stories about Africa anyway. So Africa is portrayed in a certain light of poverty, of hunger, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, Africa feeds the world. You know, so sometimes you wonder why the remainings are what we come out of. You know, so I did tell my story by persevering through it, using the little opportunities of education, because I went through the government school process, which is what the government can afford to give us. But the finances they used to run that, they even owe already in arrears from 50 years ago, paying to foreign donors. So the story goes on and on. But with music as a creative tool, like the creative industry would say, we have, I wouldn't say just we have me as a writer, as a composer, as a performer, and the populace who can relate have been able to push our narrative out there of resilience, of speaking to power in the most polite form and in the language they understand, to be able to continue to use the same creative industry to tell our stories and make Africa the promised land which it is. So I think when you pick particular songs of mine, I've been able to tell such stories. And it's a blessing that in these times, we're not singing poverty stories anymore. When you carry the fashion industry, when you carry the creative industry, we're flying in the private jets and driving all the top notch. But that does not necessarily connote to, you know, the real lifestyle on the ground, because it's only 1% of the 1% that can afford such lifestyle that paints the image of Africa in the new school as good. So, you know, there's a lot to do when it comes to that aspect as well.
Thank you. Now, Madam Petit, if I can also bring you in, you're in the business of trying to ensure that Africa opens up its borders, Africa, you know, amongst African countries. When it comes to cultural exports, whether it be music, art, and so on, how do you open up our borders even more to exchange and to, you know, to even crossbreed and you know, benefit from one another as Africans?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. I've been looking forward to it all week, and I, you know, got up and got dressed in my finest Ghanaian outfit to be on this panel. And I would have let it go, except for the fact that I really don't like panels. I don't like it when panels are all male, particularly when we're talking about something as important as the creative industry, to which African women have made major contributions. I am here in Ghana in my capacity as the principal legal advisor to the Africa Continental Free Trade Secretariat, but I'm here on this panel in my capacity as a writer. I'm a writer from Zimbabwe. I've written 4 novels. They've been translated into various languages. And so what I really want to speak to, Joseph, if I may, I will answer your question, but what I want to speak to is this question, this very interesting question that you've put to the others, which is who is telling the stories, right? And my answer is a very clear and emphatic: African women are telling African stories, right? I can start reeling off names: Doreen Baingana, Sisidanga Rembwa, Chimamanda Adichie, Taya Selassie, Novio Rosa Chuma, Violet Bulawayo. There is something that has been amazing in the last 10 years, which is the assertion of the African female voice on the world stage. And it's an African female voice that is telling not just what are considered domestic stories, but we are telling stories of our continent from different perspectives. You all know, I'm sure, Half of a Yellow Sun, which is the story of the Biafran War, but from a very human perspective, from the perspective of people who lived it. I have recently spent 20 years researching one novel which was published last year, which is the story of the African companions of David Livingstone, carrying that body, Chuma and Susi, Jacob Wainwright, Halima. I did the research to find there were 73 people, and I named them all, right? And it took me 20 years, from 1998 on a floppy disk to 2018. So my point really is that the variety of stories that we're telling is wide, and it is incredible. And our central mission, all of us, is we want to retell and reframe the African narrative. Not for the West, by the way. We don't care about the West. Usman Sembeni said, Africa is my audience, the rest are markets, right? Our audience is here, right? We are telling this story for ourselves, because this is where the narrative needs to change. There needs to be a shift, and what you're doing is exactly that. We need to have a shift in how we see ourselves before we can even, talk about how other people should see us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Matthew, to you, as I said at the beginning, African cultural exports are increasing, whether it's film, art, and so on. What do you see as some of the challenges that stand in the way of getting bigger and also reaping the benefits of our own sweat as African creatives?
I think that money is always an issue in terms of funding. We have brilliant creators, but where do they get the money to do what they envision? So that is definitely a major issue. But then there's also the pipeline. You don't wake up tomorrow and then have, over 100 great authors coming out of a country. They have to start early, But if you have, I kept it a secret that I wanted to be a fashion designer for the longest time, because I knew the perception of that. And so many other, maybe they're very talented fashion designers, musicians, or authors who cannot see the finish line. And they cannot get the support that they need to develop their talents further. So we have to start really investing in the arts from the ground level, from kindergarten. We need kids, they need to be given the freedom to see this as a viable path. And that way we can develop, great authors, musicians who will tell our stories in the best way possible.
Okay. Mutuma, same question to you, but slightly differently. One of the challenges is that Africa does not necessarily own the big means of production and mass distribution. This is in the hands of the Netflixes of this world. How do we resolve that?
The simple answer would be to correct the asymmetry in the distribution of power globally. But obviously that is not going to happen overnight. Like you said, and maybe I can speak for advertising, which I'm probably more familiar with, is that publishers have lost revenue. 2 or 3 companies have gained. And the way the international economic system is structured is such that it favors those 2 or 3 monopolies. And then you have an entire collection of smaller players just nibbling at the corners. I think maybe as much as 60–70% of all the advertising money in the world today is made by 1 or 2, at most 3 players, and a collection of middlemen. It's very difficult to see how there can be a solution without a coming together of the smaller companies and the smaller countries and smaller regions, so that they bring to bear their own regulatory authority and to force the big conglomerates to surrender some of the revenues that they are making at the expense of creatives and of small companies from weaker countries. I'm sure you will have observed what happened in Australia when they took on one of the big conglomerates. You've also seen what the threat of regulation is doing in Europe. So I think the solution lies in countries, and especially in Africa, coming together and forcing the powerful nations and the big conglomerates to subject themselves to the regulatory authority of African countries.